Oh man, The New Order. Testament's second album. It's ironic because it was the second album by this band that I also purchased. The first one being The Ritual, strangely enough. That was because I heard a song off of The Ritual. I believe it was on television. I forget exactly where I saw it or where I heard it first, but the second album that I found was The New Order. I found it at a flea market. The same flea market where I actually picked up that metal cassette that I spoke about in the Legacy review. So there's a cool little correlation there. But this is certainly one that has been cemented for a long time as one of Testament's best albums. Not to mention, this is still from the period that many people consider to be the most fruitful period of their career, although some would argue that their revitalization period over the past two albums has been damn good as well, and I would tend to agree with them. But we can't exactly dissect that chicken yet, considering we are still decades away from it. The New Order came out just a year after their very first album, after The Legacy, and this was an album that certainly saw the band with the ability to really show off their skills a little bit more now that they had that first album under their belt. Nobody really ever says that there's any sort of first album jitters, but I always imagined myself that if I was a band and I was releasing my first album, I would really be curious as to how it was, received and how people kind of took to it, simply because you don't really, even though you're part of a revolution, even though thrash at this point in time was a huge commodity, it was certainly something that was gaining a lot of viability. It was doing really, really well, and Testament was certainly showcasing themselves as a herald to the second wave of thrash metal. It's one of those things where there's no guarantee that things are going to just pop out and everything's going to work out. So whenever you get to your second album, it almost feels like you still have a fresh start, but at the same time, you kind of know what's going on. A lot of people say that after 3 kids, moms really know all about, delivering, giving birth and handling children. Well, after this first album, with the second, you kind of know how to handle making an album. Maybe not perfectly, but you definitely have gotten over maybe some of the mistakes that you've made with the first one. With this one, the definite uptick that I see is definitely in the production value, just a little bit. It's kind of a gradual uptick. It's not one that certainly is so night and day comparative to the Legacy, where it is really, really, really apparent, but it's certainly one where the fuzziness, the mustiness, kind of the dirt and grime that you heard on some tracks of the Legacy has been removed a little bit, and you have a little bit more of a flowing production style. That said, it still has a bit of a distant hum to it, but this is something that was kind of commonplace in the 1980s. You're not going to get the surefire production and sound tactics that you hear here in the 2000s, 20 years to 30 years later. As far as the music is concerned, what can't be said about this album? This album is every bit as worth the praise that has been garnered by no doubt thousands of reviewers, metal fans, and industry individuals prior to myself. However, I am certainly one that is going to offer it its own due praise, considering the amount of times and the amount of love that I have for this album, the amount of times that I have listened to this album. From the very opening moments of Eerie Inhabitants, it really just gives you that kind of goosebump atmosphere, considering you're able to kind of get a little bit of an up, you're gradually led into the fire, so to speak. It's almost like you have been blindfolded. You're walking down a corridor that's perhaps, you are surrounded by stone. Perhaps some druids have kidnapped you, and you're walking down into this place, and throughout the entirety of this album, you are basically witnessing a strange ritual of sorts, and you yourself leave this changed only to die. I don't know. It's a weird little metaphor. It doesn't even make sense, but you know what? It's kind of cool in the fact that Eerie Inhabitants can kind of lead many different people, that opening portion, to really think of different things. Imagine in Indiana Jones, whenever they're led down into the temple and they see the sacrifice and the heart being pulled out of the individual. That is certainly something that also sort of comes to mind. It's kind of a cool little metaphor in itself. But the track itself is freaking awesome. This is certainly a great introductory song for this album. It has a really cool breakdown. Alex Skolnick has the opportunity to shine from the very freaking get-go. And whenever that happens, you know that this is going to be one of those albums that where the guitarists of the world are certainly going to be having wet dreams for weeks. And the first time that you hear this album, you certainly have that capability. Back whenever I was first learning guitar, it was whenever I picked up this album. I'm still not very good at guitar, but I definitely had some wet dreams over some of the Skolnick solos and some of his licks on this album, because they are just that damn sick. Consider some of the classics that are also on this album, such as Trial by Fire, Into the Pit, which is covered by The Absence, a couple of years ago. Disciples of the Watch, Obey. Nobody's Fault was an Aerosmith cover that they chose to do on this album. Kind of a weird little move for a thrash metal band, especially on an album like this that was just going so fucking 1,000 miles per hour, literally, and then goes into this track, and you would think they would just kill all of the momentum. You would think that it would just absolutely destroy the momentum and really just destroy the whole idea of this album and its legend, but it really doesn't, because they do this in a style that is able to really capture Aerosmith's, genuinity, but at the same time put a thrash edge on it, put a Testament edge on it, and that combination actually helps build the momentum going into A Day of Reckoning and Musical Death, A Dirge, which is the instrumental final number on this album. Out of the 10 tracks, there's actually only 8 that have lyrics. There's 2 different tracks that are just instrumentals, Hypnosis being the other one, track number 5, which kind of bridges the gap between Into the Pit and Disciples of the Watch. And once again, the one thing about this album that really is going to build and encase its legend permanently for the remainder of musical existence is just the atmosphere and just the way in which this band is able to carefully craft a disc that just has all sorts of character to it and really just did a terrific job in just building this general ambiance that surrounds itself, that really just carries it, and it carries itself with a certain moxie that you just didn't see. This is one of those early second wave proof positives that this was definitely a band to be reckoned with, and a band that was going to be with us for years to come, and they were going to be making some damn good material, because wow, this album is a beast. Not to mention, this album is just overall one of the best bodies of work that you're going to hear out of the second wave of thrash metal. Not to mention, probably one of the top albums that you're going to hear from Testament in general. Strangely enough, this album is not my number 1 pick from Testament, because my number 1 pick is just stupid as all get out, but I'm going to give you a hint. It was my first Testament album, and I'll explain myself why the Black Album of Testament is my number 1 pick. But once again, we're trying to dissect chickens before we're even in that, decade, so I'm going to shut up. But overall, if you're a new fan of Testament, if you're just listening and watching to this video because it's me, because it's Cover Killer Nation, and you like me, I thank you for that. This is certainly one of the albums that I would recommend getting into first, if not the first. And that's certainly a recommendation that is brought forth with warm wishes, not to mention also one where I wish you the best of luck in finding it. The unfortunate side of these early albums from Testament is that they are a little bit difficult to find these days. However, if you can find it, especially on a cassette tape, an old cassette tape, it is certainly well worth it. And it's certainly something that I myself am questing for, because that would be a really cool cassette tape to own. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what are your favorite tracks off of the New Order by Testament? If you are new to the fold, what is something about this album that intrigues you? We have to move on. We have to do something that we never thought we'd have to do. We have to practice what we preach.